It was Thanksgiving Day of 2014. I was 10 years old at the time, but I remember that night vividly. It plays back to me nightly in my dreams with the clarity and depth of a Martin Scorsese film in 4K quality. In my dream, I could hear the howling wind and see how it caused the snow to fall rapidly and nearly at a horizontal angle. I could even feel the cold breeze from the frigid outside air as it whistled in through the kitchen window my mom left partially open to keep the main floor from overheating while the turkey baked in the oven. It was one of the coldest days in recent history, or at least that's what I remember my parents saying. As far as I was concerned, it really didn't matter to me, and I'm sure it didn't matter to my brothers and sisters either. Wasn't like we were trying to play outside or anything. In Indiana, once you entered the month of November, the weather pretty much brought an end to all outdoor activities. Anyway, we all spent the day doing our own thing. My mom cooked, my dad watched football, my brothers played video games, my sisters talked on their phones, and I was in my room with headphones on listening to music through my iPad. It may not sound like your typical television type holiday, but for all of us, to be in the house at the same time was a rare occurrence. An occurrence only a holiday like Thanksgiving could bring about. But by dinner time, we became that typical television family. Once my mother said it was time to eat, we all gathered around the dining room table, and before we bowed our heads and took each other's hands in prayer, my father made sure one last time that no one had brought their phone to the table. Once that had been established, he led us in grace. After saying amen, the eating began. We talked and laughed, joked and reminisced. In short, we were having a great family time. Somewhere between the laughter and memories, the doorbell rang. I remember thinking how strange that was because it was uncommon for someone to come calling at our door at this hour, especially on a holiday. My father got up to answer the door. I could barely hear him because of the constant chatter at the table, but I was sure he was talking to someone. I waited for the door to close at any given second, but it didn't. My father was the no-nonsense type, and under normal circumstances, he would have told whoever was at the door to go away, but this time he didn't. When I finally heard the door close, I expected to see my dad come rushing back into the dining room to finish his meal before it got cold. What I didn't expect to see was the face of another man standing beside him. He was a much older man with a build significantly slimmer than my stocky father, but what the weird-looking stranger lacked in muscle, he sure made up for in height. He towered over my dad by 6 or 7 inches. My dad introduced the man as Mr. Carver, and he said Mr. Carver's car died just up the road. He asked if he could use our phone to call his wife so she could come and pick him up. I guess my dad must have been feeling the Thanksgiving spirit because he usually never allowed any strangers inside the house. I don't think anyone at the table really had a problem with my dad's generosity though. It was freezing and windy outside, and we were the only house in sight for at least a quarter mile or so, so to me, it seemed like the only decent thing to do. My dad handed Mr. Carver his cell phone and told him he could use it by the fireplace so he could warm up. While Mr. Carver made his call, my dad sat back in his chair and absorbed the criticism from around the table. The most vocal, of course, was my mom. "Why didn't you let him use your phone outside on the porch?" she asked. My dad answered, "It's cold out there, sweetie. I would have had to stand out there too." "You shouldn't have answered the door," my brother said. My father tipped his head towards him in agreement as he shoveled a fork loaded with a stabbed piece of turkey into his mouth. "What if this guy's some sick maniac?" my sister whispered with a devilish smirk, bringing forth a chuckle from my dad and a look of slight panic from my mother. My dad must have noticed my mother's concern because he made an attempt to calm her or anyone else at the table who might have been worried. He laughed as he said in a low voice, "Come on, the guy's gotta be almost 70 years old at least. Now I'm no spring chicken, but I'm a hell of a lot younger and stronger than him. I think I can handle him if he turns out to be a wacko." "I don't know, Dad. I hear crazy people can fight," my brother joked, bringing out another laugh from my dad just before he shushed the table after catching sight of Mr. Carver making his way back towards the dining room. Upon entering, Mr. Carver handed my dad his phone back with a gracious smile on his wrinkled face. "Thank you very much, sir." "So you were able to reach your wife?" my dad asked. "I was. She'll be here to pick me up soon." "Great. Listen, you're more than welcome to wait inside for her if you like," my dad said. "Are you sure? I hate to impose." "No, it's fine. Pull yourself up a chair and take a load off. Want something to eat?" my dad asked him. "I am a little hungry," said Mr. Carver. "I wait all year for this holiday so I can have my delicacies. My wife and I have both developed fond taste for them over the years. She's just as adamant about having them as I am. I just hate that I have to leave home every year." "I hear you," my dad said, as he lifted the plate holding the turkey from the center of the table and placed it in front of Mr. Carver. "Well, have at it, old-timer. Cut yourself a nice slice or two." "Thank you," Mr. Carver said, smiling, taking hold of the turkey fork and knife. My brothers and sisters talked among themselves as my mom asked, "So, Mr. Carter, what is it you do?" I listened with half interest. Mr. Carver answered, I used to be a butcher." "Oh really?" my mom said. "You should have gotten here earlier. Maybe you could have shown my husband how to properly slice the ham and turkey." Mr. Carver and my mom laughed, while my dad smiled as he pleaded his defense. I smiled too. It's hard to explain, but for some reason I love seeing all the happy faces. I guess the energy at the table was contagious. My mom said to Mr. Carver, "I noticed you said you used to be a butcher. I take it you're retired?" "That I am, ma'am. Well, to a certain extent." "Oh? What do you mean?" she asked with genuine interest. Mr. Carver said, "Well, I don't get paid anymore to cut meat. The only time I use my butchery skills now is for recreational use. Like for when it's time to cut into those delicacies I was telling you about earlier that my wife and I enjoy." "Yeah, what are those, by the way? Something you have to buy from a special store?" my dad asked, taking a sip of wine. Sticking the fork into the turkey, Mr. Carver calmly answered, "Nah, we don't buy meat from stores. The best meats are the meats you kill yourself." I'll never forget how swiftly, how effortlessly Mr. Carver swept the sharp edge of the turkey knife across my dad's throat. Mr. Carver never took his eyes off the turkey until he yanked the fork clear and rammed it up through my mom's chin. By now, my brothers and sisters were watching the horrific shit along with me, but I think we were all frozen in shock and terror. I felt the urine soak the seat of my pants as my bladder released. I stared into my father's wide, terrified eyes as he struggled to breathe as a mixture of food, blood, and wine oozed out from the gaping slit in his neck. Staring at my mother as he held her head in place by the handle of the fork, Mr. Carver said to her, "The meat's so much fresher when you kill it yourself." He then looked at us kids and said, "Now who's going to be well behaved and not make me chase them?" Almost on cue, all of my brothers and sisters scattered from the table, running and screaming to different areas of the house. Mr. Carver may have been an old man, but he sure didn't move like one. He bolted from the table just as fast as my siblings had. As I sat there trembling, I remember thinking that this all had to be a bad dream, a sick, twisted nightmare that I was going to wake up from any second. That's when I heard my oldest sister let off a blood-curdling scream that was silenced abruptly. Then my brother let off a deafening yell that came to an immediate end too. The same thing repeated for my other siblings, back to back, all within a matter of seconds. The only sounds I heard after the last scream was that of my breathing and that of Mr. Carver's footsteps that were slowly getting louder as he made his way back towards me. I could hear him breathing heavily as he approached the dining room, but when he finally entered was the moment I realized this wasn't a nightmare. When I saw him with blood streaks on his face and huge bloodstains on his clothes, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was all very real. And as he tiredly made his way towards me, I knew I was the only one left. He sat down across from me at the table and took a deep breath before he picked up a napkin and wiped blood and sweat from his face. He then looked at me and said, "I see you're the well-behaved one of the group. You listen to your elders. Very good." I couldn't move or speak. I was totally paralyzed. He said, "I know what it's like to be the only good child surrounded by misbehaving siblings. You often find yourself wishing you were the only child. You ever find yourself wishing that?" I didn't say a word. I just stared at him through my tear-filled eyes. That's when he said, "Well, you won't find yourself wishing that anymore, kid. Mr. Carver's taking care of that for you. Now I got a few things I need to do here, and unfortunately, they won't be pleasant. Sadly, I can't risk letting you out of my sight, so you're going to have to stay right where I can see you. I recommend you close your eyes because I'm afraid I'm going to have to use this table to carry out my business, and it won't make for a pretty sight. Now, there's nothing I can do about the noises you'll hear, but feel free to hum as loud as you want if that helps you any. Sure as heck won't bother me any." He swiped everything off the table and lifted my mother's body onto the clear wood surface. He then stepped out of the dining room and went back towards the front of the house. I could hear him open the front door and then close it immediately. He came back into the dining room with a large leather case that he must have stashed outside. He stripped down to his underwear, revealing his weak, pale, pasty body, and then reached into the case and pulled out a blood-stained apron and tied it around himself. He then pulled out several cutting knives and a huge meat cleaver, each glistening like they had been freshly polished for a special occasion. What happened next was so unimaginable, so inconceivable. I actually thought for a while that he had killed me too, and at that particular moment I was in hell. I mean, where else could you be but hell when you're seeing your mother stripped out of her clothing just to have her limbs chopped off and her torso sliced open? You think shutting your eyes will spare you, but then you hear the sawing of bone that's so loud in the house that's so quiet, you gag several times before eventually throwing up. Just as the carving stops, you hear a terrible crackling sound. You open your eyes just in time to see some monster breaking back her rib cage so he can carve out her heart. Then this sick bastard looks at you with blood-stained lips because he couldn't help but take a nibble on her here and there, and says to you, There's no delicacy like the human heart, sweetie. Nothing else like it in the world. And if that still doesn't sound like hell to you, imagine having to go through that all over again with your father, your brothers, and your sisters. I sat there listening to him chop, cut, eat, break bones, slice, and then repeat for hours. It had gotten to the point where I wanted to die myself, and I told him that. I told him to just kill me and get it over with. Keep in mind, this is coming from the mouth of a child, a 10-year-old girl. That's when Mr. Carver told me he had no intention of hurting me. He told me I was a good little child in a world where good children were becoming a scarcity. He said I was an endangered species, and no honorable hunter ever kills an endangered species. After packing the organs and cuts of flesh he took from my family to individual sheets of butcher paper, he took those wrap packs and dumped them into a large black trash bag that he had removed from his leather case. He rinsed his tools along with himself in the kitchen sink and placed his knives back into the leather case too. He put his clothes back on and then his coat and his hat and told me that he would use my dad's phone to call the police and send them here once he got to his car. He threw the large black garbage bag over his shoulder, nearly tipping himself over as he did so. "Don't worry about the door, kid. I'll lock it behind myself." Before walking out of the dining room, he tipped his hat to me and wished me a happy Thanksgiving. Yeah, the fucker actually wished me a happy Thanksgiving. I guess he kept his word though, because a short while after he closed the front door, it was being kicked open by the police. They wrapped me in a blanket and took me to the hospital where I was cleaned off of the blood spatter and questioned thoroughly about the man I knew as Mr. Carver. They even had a sketch artist come and work with me. Together we succeeded in recreating a face that was the closest thing I could remember as resembling Mr. Carver. I was released from the hospital when my grandparents came to pick me up a few hours later. Despite the law enforcement manhunt, the facial sketch airing on practically every local channel, every news broadcast, and being posted up all throughout the state and posted on the internet, no leads ever came in on the man known only as Mr. Carver. He was an old man 4 years ago, so there is the slight chance that he may have died since then. He could have had a stroke or a heart attack or had something go wrong with his health that prevents him from killing again. And then there's the unsettling thought that he's still out there. Maybe he wasn't such an old man. Maybe he was just wearing makeup to make himself look older than he was. That would explain how he was able to move so quickly and efficiently. Maybe he's hiding in plain sight. Maybe he plans on coming after me since I gave the police his description. All I know for certain is that the Thanksgiving holiday doesn't exist for me anymore. It was slaughtered with the rest of my family back in 2014. I strongly suggest to all of you that if anyone comes knocking on your door this holiday, you ignore them. If they don't go away, threaten to call the police and cozy up to whatever weapon is near. But whatever you do, don't let them in, because you just never know. It could very well be Mr. Carver, the Thanksgiving mauler, standing outside your front door.